Okay, good morning everyone. Shalom Aleichem. Bruchim Abayim. We started Masechta Nedarim, which is a very geshmaka Masechta. And the first topic we're going to speak about is the basic subject of the categories of Nedarim. What I mean by that is a very basic Machlokes between Roiv Rishonim and the Ran. The Ran is of the opinion that, please take a look in the Ran, it's the fourth to last narrow line in the Ran on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, where the Ran says, Iker haneder hu sheyomer davar ze asur alai. The primary neder is where you say, this item is asur to me. Ubein she'etfisu b'davar acher, whether you're matfisid on something else, bein shelo yetfisu, or if you're not matfisid, zehu neder ha'amar b'Torah. This is the neder that is stated in the Torah. This is the neder that is stated in the Torah. What that means is, what does Hatfasa mean? Even if you don't say, Hatfasa is when you say that the item that I want to be asur should be asur like something else. Or if you just say, I want to asur this item. In other words, I could say, this kikar, this loaf is asur to me, that's without Hatfasa. Or I could say, this kikar, this loaf is asur to me like that other item, that is Hatfasa. The Ran says either way is acceptable. Ikar haneder hu sheyomer davar ze asur alai, ubein she'etfisu b'davar acher, bein shelo yetfisu, zehu neder ha'amar b'Torah. That is the neder that the Torah talks about. Ela dehecha she'etfisu, but where you are matfisid, ba'inon sheyatfisenu b'davar hanador. You have to be matfisid on something that's already asur through neder v'loy b'davar ha'asur, not on something which is asur. Kedamrina b'reish parak Shavua shtayim basra, my taima the amar kra ki yidar neder l'Hashem ad sheyidar b'davar hanador, until you make a neder and davar hanador. Kolaymar she'afal pi she'neder chal b'loy hatfasa, even though a neder is chal without hatfasa, afilu hachi im hitfisai ba'inon sheyatfisenu b'davar hanador v'loy b'davar ha'asur. So in other words, you could say, this kikar should be asur to me like a carbon or like something which is an isur neder, but you can't say this should be asur to me like a piece of like basar chazir. You can't say this should be asur to me like the meat of a pig. That's the shita of the Ran. Most Rishonim disagree. So, for example, the Rosh. You see the Rosh? Do you have the Rosh on the side of the Gemara? The Rosh says, Kol kinoi nedarim kinedarim, Kol she'enoi ikar Hashem nikra kinoi k'may hamachanashem l'chaverai, nedarim, ikar neder ha'amar b'Torah hu shematfis ha'chefetz b'davar ha'nesar al yedei iser peh kagayin carbon oy hektish oy shenishba alav. The main neder that the Torah talks about is only through the process of Hatfasa. Without Hatfasa, that is not the neder that the Torah speaks of. Okay, so it's Machlokes Ran and Rosh whether a neder could be without Hatfasa. The Ran says it could be without Hatfasa, and the Rosh says the Ikar neder is only with Hatfasa. By the way, there's also the opinion of Taisus. Right, the Ran says bein she'etfisu bein shelo yetfisu, and most Rishon, we saw the Rosh. Look in Tosfos Divrei Hamaskil Kol. See Tosfos Kol kinoi nedarim kinedarim. He says, Ikar haneder hu kishamatfis hachefetz b'davar hanador k'may da amar harei alai kikar zeh ki hektish. Let's say you say this kikar should be like hektish, v'al kikar acher omer yehei kazeh. That's a neder. You always have to be matfis b'davar hanador. You can't just say kikar zeh asur. Okay? You have to use the approach of hatfasa. Fine. But the Ran holds you don't have to use hatfasa. Comes the Shach in Hilchos Nedarim, and the Shach says something amazing. The Shach says that, you know what, there would be a very big nafkamina, ladina, between a neder, even according to the Ran, right? The Ran holds you could do a neder in one of two ways, with hatfasa or without hatfasa. There would be a very big nafkamina ladina between a neder that you use hatfasa and a neder that you don't use hatfasa. Why? The Shach writes, even according to the Ran, that you can make a neder without hatfasa. You could only do that to yourself. You can't do it to someone else. Remember, the Ran started off by saying, I could make a neder and I could say this thing should be usher to me. I could say your thing should be usher to me. I could say my thing should be usher to you. There are three types of Nedarim. I ask her my thing to me, I ask her my thing to you, I ask her your thing to me. But, says the Shach, is a nafkamina, because the Ran holds that I could use hatfasa or I don't have to use hatfasa. When I'm answering my thing to you, I have to use hatfasa. But when I answer my thing to me, or your thing to me, I don't have to use hatfasa. Let's see the Shach. And the reason is very interesting. The Mechaber says, someone says, my wine is yayin nesech, or my bread is the pas of kutim, then it's meaningless. Even though, what do you mean? He's making a neder, that it should be usher like yayin nesech. Yeah, but yayin nesech is not davar hanodor. So since it's not davar hanodor, you're matfisid in a davar ha'asr, not b'davar hanodor. Says the Shach, kivan shalei tfisa b'davar hanodor. Kasa abach, be'ikal amedek b'lashon harash, shekasa b'klal yud beis dindala demisha amar yesar yeni al kol Yisrael. Let's say somebody says, my wine should be usher to all of Israel. Im esse davar ploini. If I do X, Y, and Z, va'asoy, and he does it, loy nesar, it doesn't become usher. Why is it any different than someone who says this kikar is usher to me? Dahavenami usher. Right? If I could say this loaf is usher to me, then why can't I say my wine is usher to all of Israel? The same way, I could say this wine is usher to me, or this kikar is usher to me, af agav deloy fisa b'davar another, elo de amar stam iser. In other words, why could I say this loaf is usher to me, and I can't say my wine is usher to all of Israel? Yesh lamer deshani stam kiven damar kikar ze alai have a lashon neder. V'hachinami enoi neser elam kein amar b'lashon koinam yeni al kol Yisrael im ese kach v'kach. Aval yeser yeni al kol Yisrael ein ze lashon neder. That's not a lashon of a neder. Miu mi lashon ator mashma deloy hitter harash elamitam shehisker yayin nesach v'tzarch Iyun ad kan lashon kolomer da hator kasav. Okay. Here's where I want to get to. V'li nira. You ready for this whopper of the Shach? This is a very important idea. In other words, we want to distinguish between why could I aser my kikar to me, and I can't aser my thing to someone. After all, in the world of the Ran, you don't need hatfasa. So if I don't need hatfasa to me, why do I need hatfasa when I aser something to others? Says the Shach, v'li nira de afagav de amar kikar za asar lehavik my neder hani mishum d'chsev lesar isar al nafshoy. The type of, right, the Ran says there are two kinds of neder. There's asering and there's hatfasa. Asering is only to yourself. You can only aser to yourself. But iser neder, if you're going to aser to others, you need to be matfis b'davar hanador. In other words, like this. Even though the Ran holds that there are two kinds of nedarim, with hatfasa, without hatfasa, but they're fundamentally different. When I use a neder not with hatfasa, I'm just making an iser. If I'm just making an iser, I can only aser something to myself. But when I do hatfasa, I'm not making an iser, I'm making davar hanador. I could make an iser only to me. I could create iser neder to me and to others. So when I'm asering to myself, I don't need to use Hatfasa. I could aser. When I'm trying to prohibit to someone else, I have to use Davar HaNadur. Davar HaNadur, you need Hatfasa. Afagav, the Imam Kikar ze asar alai, havanami neder, hainu mishum duchsev lesser Israel navshay. Avo lesser al kol Yisrael eno yachal lesser kiyim bekoinam. V'lezeh kasav haTorah dafka mishum shehizkar yayin nesech mutter. But otherwise, it would be an asr to himself. So if you say like this, that my wine should be yayin nesech, it's not going to work. Because that's not an effective way to do it. You could say davar ze asar alai. Why? Because it says lesser isar al nafshay. But you can't asar to anyone else. In other words, let's just say this clearly. The Ran's opinion is, I could asar to myself, I could asar to others. The Ran also holds, I can make a neder with Hatfasa, I could make a neder without Hatfasa. However, the Shach is Machadesh, that the ability to make a neder without Hatfasa is only for you yourself, but you can't do it to someone else. Because there's a fundamental difference between a neder without Hatfasa and a neder with Hatfasa. A neder without Hatfasa is merely an Isser. An Isser is lesser Isser al nafshay, is only for yourself. But Davar HaNadur is even a Davar HaNadur which is Hatfasa, which means you're utilizing something that was already Aser through Isser Neder that you could use for someone else. So again, the Chiddush of the Shach is that there's a fundamental difference between using, again, the Rosh and Tosfos hold, Neder is only with Hatfasa. The Ran holds, you don't have to use Hatfasa. But even the Ran who holds you don't have to use Hatfasa, that's only regarding yourself. But for others, there would be, but for others, you could not create an Isser Neder, you could only with Hatfasa. So in other words, even though the Ran holds you could Aser, even though the Ran holds Neder works without Hatfasa, but that would only work for yourself, not for others. For others, you would have to use the process of Hatfasa. That's one nafkamina between Shitas Haran and Shitas the Rosh and Tosfos. Here's another interesting nafkamina brought in the Mishnah Lamelech. The Mishnah Lamelech brings an amazing opinion of the Mahalbach. Let's say you say this kikar is usher to me like besar chazir. The neder is chal. Not like what the Ran seems to say, that if you say this is usher to me like a pig, it doesn't work because you're being matfisit bedavar ha'asur and you have to be matfisit bedavar hanodor. But the Mahalbach holds it works. Why? Because you said it's usur. You added like a pig? Who cares? It doesn't ruin it. So the Mishnah Melech says it's going to depend on the Ran and the Rosh. That according to the Ran, that there is such a concept of Neder as an Isser, so then you could make the case that if a guy says that something should be Asr like a pig, it will be Asr. But according to the Rosh and Tosfos, there's no concept of Neder as an Isser. Neder only works as Isser Neder. Well, Basar Chazir is not an Isser Neder. There is no concept of Neder as a Davar Ha'asur. Well, if there's no such concept, then if somebody says this thing should be also like Basar Chazir, it would be meaningless. Now the truth is, the Ran personally, even though he holds there's a type of Neder which is working through Isser, he holds if you say Kabasar Chazir, it doesn't work. But we could hear where the Mahalbach is coming from. The Mishnah Melech in Hilchos Nedarim, Parak Aleph, Halacha Zayin, he says, V'zacharni sheraisi b'tshuvas Mahalbach, ba'omer le'ishtoi, harei ad asura alai ki'ima. Somebody says to his wife, you are usher to me like my mother. He says, D'chal ho'isser, af shehidfis v'davar ha'asr, D'davka ba'omer harei ad ki'ima. Only when you say this should be like pig, or this should be like a mother, then we say lo yamar klum. Because he didn't say isser. It's only, you want to use hatfasa only. You want to use hatfasa only, well, you can't use davar ha'asr, you're only davar hanadar. But if you say this should be asr kedavar ha'asr, so then forget about the pig and forget about the mother. You said it should be asr. The davka ba'omer arei ad ki imo hudamrin d'lamer klamishim the ikar nidra shel zeh machmas hatfasa hi. V'chol shehitfes davar asr lamer klum ba'omer arei ad asur alai, there's a neder. V'li nira that this would be dependent on the ran. That what, according to what it says in Shvua, he said if you're not matfisid, it only works as a yad, but it won't work through the process of neder. We could only use a yad if he didn't finish his words, but if he finished his words, we can't change his words in a way that he himself didn't finish it. So if somebody says harei ad asur alai like a mother, of course it's not going to work. Why? Because he was matfisid bedavar ha-asur. And the only reason why, if you're not matfisid, it works, it can only work midin yad, according to some Rishonim. But yados will not work if you filled in all the blanks. But according to the Ran, in the very first comment of the Ran in the Masechta, that when someone says, Hareza asur alai, it's a neder gamor. Because a person could asur on himself, davar hamuter, b'loi hatfasa. Then you could say like the Marabach, someone who says, Hareza asur alai, it's asur. He said like a mother. So we'll take that away. Dal mehacha, it's not worse. There's a concept where a person could asr on themselves something, even though he was matfisid b'davar ha'asr, and that's not effective. So we'll ignore that which he said ki'ima or ki chazir. In other words, like this. The halacha is that if somebody says davar ze asr alai, it's an effective neder. Why? So Tosfos and the Rosh, who say that a neder only works if you're matfisid, they would say, you know why? If somebody says hareza asur, it's effective, it's yados nedarim. We'll fill in the blank. Even though you didn't say davar za asur like kikarbon, we'll fill in that you meant kikarbon. However, but if you said you don't mean kikarbon, you said you mean like a davar ha'asur, like a pig, or like my mother who's asur to me, then there's nothing we could do. There's no way it could work. Because the only way somebody who says davar za asur alai works is because we fill in the blank. We can't fill in the blank if you filled it in wrong. But the Ran's opinion is, the reason why if you say davar za asur alai it works is not because it's yados, it's because a person has the ability not only to create an isser that's like a neder, but to create an isser for himself. So even though you are matfisid b'davar ha'asur and that's not effective, we could ignore the ending that you put in. In other words, we're able to ignore an improper ending you put in, but we can't change it. Okay? So that's the first sugya in a nutshell. Let's summarize. We have Machlokes, a major Machlokes Rishonim and Nedarim. Does Neder work only through Hatfasa? And that's the opinion of Tosfos and the Rosh. And they hold that the way Neder works is, it has to be where you're answering something like a carbon or like davar hanador. And if somebody would say davar za asur alai, the only reason it works is because of yados nedarim. We fill in the blank. The Ran, on the other hand, holds a neder could work through hatfasa, it could work without hatfasa. Is there any nafkamina between the Ran as opposed to Tosfos and the Rosh? We learned two nafkaminas. One nafkamina, the Shach says, is if I want to asr my friend, that even the Ran, a nafkamina, but not a nafkamina between the Ran and other Rishonim. Within the Ran, that they're Nedarim of Hatfasa, Nedarim without Hatfasa, a nafkamina would be when I'm asering my friend. So I could say that my bread is asr, should be asr to me, because isr could be to myself. I cannot say my bread should be asr to someone else. I can't make an isser to someone else. I can make an isser neder to someone else. I could say my bread should be usher like a carbon to someone else. Or I could say my bread should be usher like a davar hanadar to someone else. But if I say my bread should be like pig to someone else, it's meaningless. I can't create an isser to someone else. I can only create a davar hanadar. That's the chiddush of the Shach. The chiddush of the Maharbach is that if I say this thing should be asur, kedavar ha'asur, so in the world of Tosfos and the Ran, where the only type of neder is Hatfasa, if you mess up the Hatfasa and you say it should be nitfas b'davar ha'asur, it will be meaningless. But in the world of the Ran, I could ignore that and it could still work because I'm creating an isser for myself. Rabbi said that's the first subject. Okay, the basic is a very fundamental machlokes, the Ran versus other Rishonim, showing an afkamina within the world of the Ran between the difference between yes hatfasa or no hatfasa, and an afkamina between the Ran and the other Rishonim. There's another topic on Daf Beis. With your permission, I think it's worthwhile to be familiar with a little bit. Okay, let's look at it.